Good evening, everyone. I'm joined again by Dark Enlightenment. How are you, D?
I'm doing good, buddy. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. You have been hitting it out of the park lately. The commentary has been hot and heavy from Jose, and it's been really, really good to see you get out there in the wider sphere of things. I think that your takes, particularly on foreign policy, are invaluable. I've just been enjoying it. I'm happy for your success, man.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring you on specifically for this because as we were talking about before the recording of the nearly 200 shows I've recorded under this banner, we really haven't delved into the finer details about Catholicism, and especially from a traditional Catholic perspective. And I wanted to bring you on to just talk about your journey into traditional Catholicism and what prompted you to take that route. So yeah, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Dark Enlightenment. Jose and I are fortunate enough to mutually appear on our mutual friend Pete Kinner's Thought Crime Syndicate about once a month. We just did one of those a couple weeks ago. I do my own show with my co-host Patrick, Fundamental Principle, where we're trying to marry illiberal religion and illiberal politics because they go together. And the reason I do that is all my friends that were traditional religious, they had this ridiculous idea of democracy and equality and all kinds of other stuff. And all the guys I knew from the hard right, illiberal political stuff, a lot of them were atheists or had, in my mind, erroneous political ideas. And I have come to the conclusion after many years of thinking about this sort of thing and reading and 20 years of being kind of either a reader or a participant in this space of and writing and correspondence with people, that you can't really have one without the other. And to set the stage a little bit, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm either the youngest Gen Xer or the oldest millennial, depending on who you ask. And I was raised in indifferentist. Not indifferent. My parents made sure I went to church every week, but not really super, super serious Novus Ordo Catholic home, which like most people. And I went to a relatively good parish growing up, and the priest was solid, and a lot of people participated in teaching the kids the different CCD stuff. And I just noticed that it didn't work. And sometime around 2005 or 6, the Iraq War was a disaster. I had started reading things like Mencius Moldbug, and I started out in kind of the same space as you had, Jose, of 2A stuff. And 9/11 had happened, and so naturally, I started reading about our Second Amendment rights and prepping, and what to do if we're attacked by these people that hate us for our freedom, and where does that go? And then you come to the conclusion, there's a lot I don't particularly like about Curtis Yarvin now, but at the time he was very valuable because he just broke you out of the idea. That Ron Paul in 2008 was a genuine alternative. I don't know if they actually stole the election from him or not, but that showed us, right, is that you had to have power to oppose power. The whole idea of libertarianism of I'm going to force you to leave me alone is not really a viable option. And once you understand that liberal politics is a non-starter. There is no such thing as liberal politics where everybody's equal and everybody gets to say, and your vote and my vote count just as much as Bill Gates and Elon Musk, right? That's ridiculous. Well, but we're all both citizens, right? So why should, because he has $1 billion, because he has billions of dollars and he can buy everybody in Congress is why, right? And every society is an oligarchy. Every society has a hierarchy. Every society necessarily has to be organized from the top down. There's no bottom up organizing of society. You can organize in little groups to do other things. You could do things like fraternal groups and what have you, but you can't take over a society that way. You need to gather so much, you could gather so much power that way, the Blackshirts did or something in Italy, that you then take over the top and then take over society that way. But there's no way that like you just change everybody's mind, man. We'll just tell people about freedom and ending the Federal Reserve and like love bombs for Ron Paul. And I love Ron Paul. I genuinely do. I admire him very much. You know, he's still, I think, an admirable person. His commitment to peace, I think, is really great. But you can't impose that. And what I learned over time is that religion, I can't remember, like you have a background in like game and PUA stuff too, right?
Yes,
A little bit.
I had a brief stint. Yeah.
A lot of that stuff's kind of degenerate, and I wouldn't necessarily want to promote a lot of that stuff. But one of the things that they said that was really, really super valuable and is, you know, by the frame, by the farm. And in the religious context, you would get presuppositional apologetics, like William Lane Craig would be debating these atheists. And, you know, for a lot of people, right, the presupposition is just like science is right and religion is wrong. Hold up. Why? Why do you think that is? Why do you think human equality is a given? Like you believe in evolution, but it stops at the neck and has absolutely no effect on the way people think, feel, or act whatsoever. Right? Well, hold on. That's ridiculous. So you get these ideas that are obviously wrong, these liberal, large L, capital liberal, not like leftist or, you know, liberal in the current political context, but in the larger, like liberal ideas are genuinely wrong. They don't comport with human nature. They don't comport with human beings as is. And once you accept that, you have to start thinking about like religion. And our friends Pete and Thomas talk about this all the time, the Nuremberg regime. Well, the Nuremberg regime is essentially dedicated to liberalism, large L. And so the Catholic Church, you know, up until Vatican II, was explicitly illiberal. There was a pope. He was a monarch. He was an absolute monarch. He was the monarch of monarchs. You know, in Christendom, like he could hypothetically, you know, according to some Catholic political theorists, be like, nope, that's just not acceptable. And, you know, faithful Catholics would have to go against what, you know, their supposed kings or republics or whatever wanted, because the Pope said no. That was it, when Kennedy ran in 1960. That was a real, actual, genuine concern. They were Pius XI called Mussolini a gift from God. So you had this massively illiberal institution that was worldwide, and then the council happens starting like 1962. And everything changes. All seven sacraments change. The mass changes. It becomes vastly more Protestant. It becomes more horizontal and less vertical. I'm not an expert on, you know, the council and all the different problems with it, but there are a huge numbers of problems with it. Starting with things like Nostra Aetate, right? We're supposed to, together with the Jews, we worship the one God. Okay, well, wait a second. If you have not the Father, you have not, or you have not the Son, you have not the Father. The Jews curse Jesus Christ. So how can they have the Father then? Like there's contradictions here, and there's real problems. And of course, Nostra Aetate was written by a Jewish convert who was a homosexual and left the priesthood. And religious indifferentism, ecumenism, the feminization of the church, the women taking over everything. Once you understand that these are all problems that need to be addressed, and that, you know, as our Lord said, like by your fruits you shall know them, right? Once you look at like what's happened to the church, are there more priests? No. Are there more religious? No. Are there more marriages? No. Are there more baptisms? No. Are more people going to church? No. Like across the board, every metric you want to choose, vast decline in everything. And so what's happened? And once you start asking those kind of questions, you end up looking at, you know, tradition and saying, okay, well, one of the things that you're taught when you're doing land navigation in like Boy Scouts or things like that is like, if you're lost, right, and you can go find your way back to the last place where you knew where you were at, go there. So in religion, you can go back to 1960. And the Catholic Church was not insane, and there were problems. Certainly, there were modernists. There were, if you listen to what Bella Dodd had to say, that were already like communist homosexuals in the priesthood and running a lot of things in the church. Cardinal Spellman was certainly Cardinal Spellman of New York was probably a homosexual, and Bernardin in Chicago, who I don't know when he became a cardinal, but he was definitely not a good man. I think he was actually an open outright Satanist. But so there were problems, but everything seemed to be pretty good in 1960. And by 1970, everything had fallen apart. And I think you're a little younger than I am, but of the people that you went to church with as a kid, right? The kids that were in your in your religious ed classes, now that you're a grown adult, what percentage of those do you think still go to church? 10% maybe? 15, 20?
Yeah, yeah, something like that. Barely any.
Right. I mean, and when you go and you hear it's ugly, the buildings are ugly, the music sucks. It's like Peter, Paul, and Mary, gather us into this, like it's like what a boomer woman's idea of what cool was in 1973, like Frozen and Amber. And like, that's what's supposed to be cool and hip. Like, no, this was terrible. And if you want something that's like transcendent and meaningful and timeless, you could go back to like chants that are, 1,000 years old, 500 years old, Gregorian chant. It's beautiful and mysterious and interesting. You could do all that stuff, but most people, just don't have access to that. And when that was liberated in 2007 with Summorum Pontificum and the old mass was liberated, thousands and thousands of young people like saw what they'd been robbed of. And I started going like right around then, like maybe slightly before, but in the 20 years since, I basically just stopped going to the new mass unless I absolutely have to, and then I just grit my teeth the whole time. But once you understand that, like, you've been robbed of this, and the church has this saying, lex credendi, lex oriendi, like as you pray is how you believe. So if you pray like a liberal, modernist, egalitarian mass, you'll believe liberal, egalitarian, modernist politics, or liberal, egalitarian, modernist family stuff, and feminism will be a problem, and the lack of structure in the family will be a problem, and you'll have all kinds of other problems. And the questions that the church is meant to answer, like how shall we live, and how do we live virtuous lives, and what are we to do when we come across problem X, Y, Z, right? The only answers to those things are illiberal, because human beings don't do well when you just say, well, do whatever you want. If do whatever you want, like if do as I will, it shall be the whole law, then what's the point of going to church? Oh, I really like getting up early on Sunday morning and wearing uncomfortable clothes and listening to, some dude in a dress tell me about how I'm bad for wanting a country. Like, okay, yeah, I'll just sleep in or watch football. Thanks. Not really all that, useful a way of doing things. And I noticed that as I got more into tradition, the politics started making more sense. The religion side made more sense. The people who adhered to one tended to adhere to the other. Like I've had, like random people at traditionalist chapels be like, the Holocaust is fake, right? I'm like, oh. Right, but like low key, they'll talk about that stuff, because once you understand, and that every week going to this mass that's low key anti-Semitic just by its nature. If you go to a solemn high mass with a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon, the subdeacon represents the Jews typologically, and the deacon represents the faithful. When the priest takes the missal and transfers it from the right side of the altar to the left side, to the gospel side, the subdeacon covers his eyes, symbolizing the blindness of the Jews. Right? And if the Jews are our elder brothers and they didn't do anything wrong and the Holocaust was terrible, and then all the stuff they're doing now with the usury and the promotion of vice and abortion and usury and USA, usury, sodomy, and abortion, those are all Jewish. The mass murder of Christians in Gaza, then they can't be criticized, except if they're not well, if they are, they were the children of the covenant, and then they broke the covenant, and then they're wicked, and they're the children of Satan, as our Lord himself says. Then you can say, well, actually, these people are bad, and they're doing bad things, and they all have always done bad things. And you go back through history, and you can go to, the murder of our Lord, the stoning of St. Stephen, the destruction of, the opening the gates at Toledo. Pick an incident, right, where like Jews have not been friendly to Christian civilization. They never have. They've always preferred strangers and outsiders and what have you to Christian civilization. And one of the reasons that, the new mass or the old mass is being suppressed is because the people in charge of our society know it's illiberal. They know it creates people like me. That if you go to this old mass long enough and if you understand the political and religious issues, you're going to be strengthened in it. You're going to find more ways to resist the regime. You're going to understand why the regime is wrong better than before you would. If you don't understand all this stuff, if you just go along to get along, you're going to end up stuck in like an ugly Novus Ordo suburban parish with felt banners on the wall and ugly polyester vestments on a gay priest who's telling you that, defense of your home is ipso facto immoral because 20% or 30% or whatever of the bishop's budget comes from government aid for migration. Well, and what happens in those cases is for a lot of people, they just stop going. Like, if I want to get lectured by a bunch of obnoxious gay guys wearing weird clothes, I can tune into other podcasts.
Yeah.
If that's your bag, man, there are podcasts for you out there. You listen to the Don Lemon Show or something, or other people who shall not be named. But like, what's the point of that then?
How, when you compare the Catholic Church these days to, say, like the regular Catholic Church to like traditional Latin Mass, how contaminated would you say most churches are with just these LGBT mass migration tropes?
2/3 to 75% or more. I mean, like 2/3 of the clergy are probably gay, or at least inclined that way, and maybe half the bishops or more. I mean, the way these sort of things work, right? Like, you're familiar with the problem of mercury in seafood?
Yes.
Okay, so for the listeners, right? Like, the small fish might have like a little bit of mercury in them, but as the fish get bigger and bigger and bigger, like they get more and more mercury because they're eating all the small fish, and so like a really big tuna might be like actively poisonous to eat because there's so much mercury in the fish. In a similar way, right? Like, certain people just by existing create conspiracies. Homosexuals and Jews being two types of those people, right? There's anytime someone engages in a perverted act, right? There's the two or more people involved in the act who know what, like, like, I know it was you at the, weird gay orgy, cocaine orgy at the Holy Office, Monsignor. So you can't complain to me. And this actually happened, right? There's a cocaine fueled gay orgy at the Holy Office of the Inquisition like 10 years ago, right? It was really bad. The police had to be called. It was highly embarrassing under Francis, or Bergoglio. And you might have like manly, decent guys who enter seminary, but a lot of them get washed out because they're devoted to the rosary, or they wear the traditional garb, or they try and preach the traditional sermons and try and inculcate traditional virtues, and they don't talk about migrants or racism or the need to respect, whatever, the spirit of the age. They don't bow to it. And so they get washed out. And then whatever percentage of those guys make it to ordination, they get stuck at like the most remote parish in the diocese, 200 miles from the cathedral and the chancery office. And, they get given like the 1990, the church has the 1997 Toyota Corolla with 275,000 miles on it for their car, and they're living in this little rectory by themselves in the middle of nowhere with their one parish where they barely make any money because the parish is small and shrinking, and the rural areas, or maybe they have 2 or 3 parishes out in the middle of nowhere, rural America, that they have to go to. So they're constantly just busy, and they're certainly not kept at any kind of, they're not invited anywhere near power. And so the people who are the liberals and the people who aren't interested, or more interested in promoting liberalism than the traditional faith. And as you go up, and those guys become monsignors, and then bishops, and then cardinals. And
when would you say was like the turning point for the Catholic Church just degenerating into its present state?
Oh, Vatican II for sure. I mean, it was bad before, and Bella Dodd talks about this. And like I said, there were people who were known modernists before that, like the guy who, Monsignor Annibale Bugnini, the guy who wrote the New Mass, was probably a Freemason. Cardinal Spellman was probably a homosexual of New York. So there were bad things, but at Vatican II it's the defining moment. There's before and then after, and it's much, much worse after in every metric.
Yeah, what exactly did Vatican II establish, and who were like the main players and like subversive actors that ushered in those changes?
Well, I mean, there were subversive actors all over the place. There were, in fact, it was a council of the whole church, and there were like Cardinal Ottaviani, who was the head of the Holy Office at the time. That what's used to be the Inquisition is now the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Lord, how that institution has fallen. There were like schemas to prevent schemas. Schema is this is what we're going to talk about in the council, and then that was hijacked by German liberals. I think it was mostly German liberals who then substituted their own schema, and then they wrote all these documents. And Sacrosanctum Concilium Dei Verbum Gaudium et Spes Lumen Gentium Dignitatis Manor Nostra Aetate. There's all these documents, legal and related to the Second Vatican Council, and a lot of them are very problematic. And I'm not a theologian, so I'm not qualified to give comment on them. There are people who have done so, and that I would recommend, looking up a traditional interpretation of the documents, and from either the Society of St. Pius X or other traditionalists, because they'll get into the specifics of this is this error, and here's why. But the really big ones are like Nostra Aetate, the church and other religions, right? Where, together with the Muslims, we adore the one God. Well, again, or, the Jews are our elder brothers in faith. Like, are they really? Or are they like the children of Satan, like God said? Is the Catholic Church the one true church founded by Jesus Christ, outside of which there is no salvation? Or is it like a constituent church of, the big C church? And you can get saved in Pastor Bob's evangelical Bible church that meets in a trailer on, and Pastor Bob just, went to correspondence Bible school, and that's still the church. Which one is it? And there's problems with all of these documents, and all of them have at least what looks like contradictions with prior teaching, which of course in Catholicism is not really something that they can self-admit, right? Because the idea of the magisterium, the teaching of the church being constant through time, you can refine stuff, but you can't contradict yourself. Well, if King St. Louis IX, who's a saint, King of France, is like, nope, the only way to argue for a layman to argue with a Jew is to stab him. And then 800 years later or 700 years later, the Jews are our friends. Which one is it? And, there are places, Catholic State, the YouTube channel, where Dr. Deep State or my own fundamental principle channel, like there are places where you can learn the faith or learn the truth about, like, say, our relationship with Jews, but it's not evident from these documents that they do not understand themselves as they understood themselves previously. Right? You could start like putting on dresses and calling yourself Josefina, and you'd still be the same guy, but your understanding of yourself would be very, very different. And
yeah, no doubt.
right, like, and that's almost kind of what happened to the church. Like it and Dignitatis Humanae, Nostra Aetate, Lumen Gentium, Sanctus Sanctum, like these are all difficulties, and there are better traditionalists out there who can kind of get into the details. Louis Verrecchio, for one, he used to be, much like myself, he was like a Novus Ordo conservative who like really dove into the Vatican Council, and he even produced like a pro-council catechesis set, and then came to the conclusion that actually it was wrong, and has since become a sedevacantist, which I don't necessarily share that position. The sedevacantist position being that has been no legitimate pope since 1958, but they're observably intellectually serious and trying to be Catholic.
Yeah, what are sedevacantists? I've never really understood that.
Okay, so broadly speaking, the church falls into the following categories. You got your absolute, like, total rad lib types that like believe that the documents of the council mean we got to like do gay about sex and communism. Then you have your Novus Ordo lib, like moderate libs who just are like democratic socialist types, the Christian Democrat types in Europe. Then you have your Novus Ordo conservatives who once again, like the Republicans in the United States or the Tories in Great Britain are in fact the biggest problem, because they want to preserve the revolution, right? They want to do the, Thelma and Louise drive off the cliff, but at the speed limit, right? And ideas get taken to their logical conclusion. So they just want to do it slower. And then there's a break between them and traditionalists. And that's what the whole, like, Pope Bergoglio, his whole thing was, like, when he got rid of, when he got Traditionis Custodes in, I think 2000, well, like 4 years ago. I can't even remember when it was. So you have your various different flavors of traditionalists, like people who reject reject the whole, like, council. And you have your recognize and resist people who will be like, yes, he's the Pope, but this is wrong, and we're going to cling to the prior teaching because you can't, like, it's inherently contradictory to make this new teaching that conflicts with the old teaching and make that like, it can't happen that way. So we're going to cling to the old teaching and hope that, like, Rome mends its ways. And that would be like groups like the Fraternal Society of St. Peter or the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest. These are what used to be called Ecclesia Dei, which is the commission that John Paul II set up to, like, give people the Latin Mass. And then you have your, like, Society of St. Pius X types, who Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre of happy memory didn't go along with the council. Like, he signed documents, but he saw how bad it was, and he's like, nope. He opened a seminary in Cologne, Switzerland in the 60s or 70s. He started training traditionalist priests, and now today they have hundreds of priests all over the world. And without him, there would be no tradition, right? They're the ones who say, we're part of the church, but, we hold on to eternal Rome. We do not believe any of this nonsense about ecumenism and religious liberty and, indifferentism and all that. And then you would have the folks like the Society of St. Pius V or other various sedevacantist groups. And sedevacante comes from the Latin of vacant chair. The C is vacant. Sede vacante. And that position is that every pope since 1958 has been invalid because a true pope wouldn't call a council to destroy the faith. So therefore, this man can't be the pope. And we're waiting on a true pope to come back into the church and fix things. And I have sympathies for some of that position. Oh, and then of course, a relatively recent post 2007 Summorum Pontificum rediscovery of the Latin Mass. You have what it would be like the Benevacantis position, or that Benedict XVI was the last reigning pontiff, and that Bergoglio and Provost are somehow illegitimate for like legal or canonical reasons, or that there's some irregularity in their elections prevent them from being the Pope. Now that's the position I hold as probably most likely, but I have sympathies for all of them. And I'm more of a political guy than a theologian. So I don't get offended when people hold out any one of those, as long as people understand the difficulties with the modernist council, and there is no really such thing as a liberal religion, right? Because you can see it in Minneapolis right now. Like, there are people who are like saying, take off your America flag sweatshirt. Don't wear that here. Like, you are blaspheming by wearing an American flag sweatshirt. We don't do that here. This is against our religious values. Take that off. Just the same way that, like, if you were to wear something, mocking Christ in like Paris in like 1200, like, you'd be told, like, take that off right now, and someone would force you to do it. So I'm not, again, within that broad swathe of, yeah, he's the Pope, but we cling to the old Mass and the old sacraments, all the way to, he's not the Pope. We reject everything he says. We cling to the old faith in hopes that, like, something will happen. There's a very broad spectrum. And I don't know how many Catholics that is constitutes in the church right now. Maybe at most like 5%. But as we talked about on my show, a couple weeks ago, right? Like, there's no future in, the Novus Ordo, happy clappy liberal stuff, because why not just be Protestant? If you can get saved in the Protestant church, and you don't need to do things like go to confession or necessarily be at Mass every Sunday, or you can get divorced, right? Like, why do all the hard work of staying Catholic? It makes no sense. So that traditional side of things is growing vastly, vastly faster, and they retain their people better, and they have more kids. Like, the average Novus Ordo parish has like 1.8 kids per woman. I saw recently, I think, which is, of course, below replacement. The average traditional parish has like 3 kids per family or more. And not only do they have more kids, but they retain their people better. Like 80% of the people who are raised traditional, they'll maintain the faith. Whereas, 2/3 of the people who were raised Novus Ordo, and these are just numbers off the top of my head, I'd have to, go back and find the numbers exactly, but they're really bad. They're really, really bad in the Novus Ordo. And, in the traditional side of things, they're not. 99% of the people who go to Mass in the traditional side of things don't, believe in the Eucharist. They don't practice contraception, things like that would be pretty basic Catholic teaching, 50 years ago. They're 70 years ago now.
Which figures or prominent leaders and or influencers in the traditional Latin Mass space do you respect?
Well, there's a lot of people. I mean, unfortunately, because there's such a lack of ecclesiastical leadership in the church right now, there's no like one person, like bishops, you can point to and say that guy's got it on solid. There was Archbishop Michel Lefebvre, but he died many years ago, and he was the founder of Society of St. Pius X, and he's the only reason anyone has tradition at all, because even the Ecclesia Dei communities like Fraternal Society of St. Peter is an offshoot of priests who were with the society who wanted to go back to Rome. Let's see. Father James Maudley is someone I would. He's actually suspended from the Fraternal Society. I believe it's the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. He's done some really great work on the fact that the Holocaust is fake and he will be actually speaking at Germer Rudolph's Holocaust conference on this coming Tuesday on the 27th. He's done a bunch of work on that because that's the basis of the new religion is the Holocaust. Our Bishop Richard Williamson sadly passed away last year, I believe, about a year ago. He was outstanding. He was English, and he was kicked out of the Society of St. Pius X. He was one of 4 bishops consecrated in 1988 that led to a rupture with Rome, and was solid on the Holocaust question and understood that was the new basis of a new religion. And so Father Maudsley and Bishop Williamson, a lot of their stuff is available online, and they're both very generous. I've interviewed Father Maudsley on my show, but Bishop Williamson was very generous with his time. And so, a lot of young guys that are kind of in our thing or adjacent would ask him questions and he'd answer them, and he'd talk about, he was a very, very wise man and very, very well educated. I believe he went to Oxford. He was a teacher, knew all kinds of stuff about literature, Latin, numerous like podcasts, on mine and others were kind of talking about these issues. And that again runs the gamut from totally the podcast space, it's like the political space. There's kind of one for everybody. Personally, I'm just so busy. I don't really have time for listening to much stuff anymore. I mean, other than like stuff you do and stuff Pete does and a couple other people, I don't really have a lot of time. I would say that Dr. Taylor Marshall, if you're looking for like an introduction, like all the stuff that, like an introduction to this stuff, he has a lot of stuff in his back catalog that's really good. If you're looking for like clergy that have a lot of stuff going on, I learned quite a bit from the Sedevacantists priests and Bishop Dolan from Most Holy Trinity Cemetery, or seminary, not cemetery, Most Holy Trinity Seminary and True Restoration Media. They have a lot of this stuff about like, here are the problems with the council and here are the problems with the different documents. And the late great Father Cicada, who sadly passed away a few years ago from cancer, his book, Work of Human Hands, was just magisterial on the problems with the new mass. And again, like I'm not a theologian, so like the full, but suffice to say that like the entire thing is deliberately constructed to alter the faith of the people who attend the mass to be more Protestant and less in line with Catholic tradition. Well, yeah, Father Anthony Cicada, Cecada, and he was in, I want to say, Westchester, Ohio, St. Gertrude the Great Church there. The Society of St. Pius X has their own podcast and their own podcasts. I think those are really good. They have some great sermons. If you're more our guy and looking for stuff to listen to that's kind of in that space, there's my show, A Fundamental Principle. Dave Riley over at The Backlash is traditional Catholic. Tim Gordon is adjacent to us, but not really our guy. The guys over at Avoiding Babylon are very funny, and they're starting to come our way on some political issues. They're very friendly. But all you need to do is get plugged in a little bit, and you'll find there's lots of books. There's more material than you could ever consume, really. And the fundamental problem is that no one who's allowed to speak in public with a big platform is allowed to be honest and honestly discuss things. Like, if we were to really sit down and be like, okay, well, just exactly how many Jews really died from 1938 to 1946. Let's actually discuss this, like the grown-up adults and, evidence and censuses and whatever, Carlo Montagna and Guillermo Rudolph have done that. And, do they say no one died? No, they don't say that at all. They say lots of people died. It was a war. It was terrible. Millions and millions of people died. It was, people starved. They got shot. There was disease. It's not possible, for something that catastrophic to happen and someone just skate through, be untouched completely. But was it the most evil thing to ever happen ever in the history of the world? No, it wasn't. And in a similar vein, if you start talking about, the problems in the church and you don't address them honestly of this is a real problem that the church has been, effectively castrated and destroyed, and is a tenth of what it used to be in terms of members, or in terms of like people who actually understand the faith, then it's a real problem. And honestly, addressing the issue of like, okay, well, does this era go back to Lumen Gentium? It might. Does this era go back to Nostra Aetate? It might. Let's talk about that and deal with that issue. And again, a lot of that it's downstream of Jewish power, because a lot of the people who were involved in the Second Vatican Council were Jews or conversos. And the book "The Plot Against the Church" by Maurice Penier is really good about that. I think you can still get it on Amazon. Not sure, but that's a good book. They have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre is really, really fantastic. It's a short book on the problems with liberalism. Michael Davies was like one of the trad godfathers of writing about this stuff. And, understand if you're listening to this show and you're like under, I don't know, 30 or 40, like a lot of the people who were like older than you and a little bit clueless, like, dude, they had no idea. Like, all they saw about Martin Luther King was the stuff they saw on television. The 1350 memes, they don't know. So, I mean, have a little bit of patience with people, because people are going to boomer it up sometimes. But there's lots of information out there. And if people are interested in like learning more, it's readily available.
One thing I've noticed over the last few years is obviously like this broader resurgence in the interest of Catholicism, but this has come with the rise of figures like Adrian Vermeule and others that are very suspicious.
Oh, Vermeule's a scumbag.
And yet go into what makes him a suspect individual, and also call out any other people that are leading many people astray, that are getting into this kind of stuff that pose as like dissidents, but really.
So Patrick Deneen, the I think he's friends with J.D. Vance, but he wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed or whatever. And it's kind of like along the lines of like The American Conservative, the magazine founded by Pat Buchanan, on like understanding like, okay, liberalism is a problem, but they don't really want to rock the boat too hard. Adrian Vermeule is a guy that, like, I think he went to Harvard. He went to a big school, right? And he recognized, all these problems were recognizable as problems like half a century ago, right? Like by 1970, like a lot of this stuff was like obviously a problem, right? The civil rights revolution had obviously been like hijacked or failed or something by 1970. All you have to do is go back to that series that Jose and I first met on in Race War in high school. By the mid 1960s, it was clear that the civil rights revolution in America was not going to work out. And, by 1970, basically people had just given up, and the solution was like run away and move to the suburbs, which isn't much of a solution, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And Vermeule understood this probably 10 years ago. And he, rather than like get mad that people have been lied to and sent to hell and all that, he was like, oh, we have to contain this. Otherwise, like the post-war liberal order will collapse, because no one will believe it anymore, and it will have no moral force. And that would be bad, because then bad things would happen to Jews and queers and women and what have you. And it's like, what? Like that? Like, so just letting all these people destroy society is good, because if we don't stop them, like bad things will happen to them, and that's unacceptable. Like, what are you even talking about, bro? And he's a very good writer, right? He's clever, and he's a professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School, so he knows what he's talking about. It's just that he's trying to keep things, because his wife is named Yun Su, right? So, right, like Latin mess guys with Asian wives, or semi-libertarian guys with Asian wives is a thing. So he permits so if you just go to his wiki, right? He got a Harvard University BA, JD. His father, Cornelius Clarkson Vermeule III, was the curator of ancient and classical art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. His mother was a professor of philology, love of languages, and archaeology at Harvard. So he's graduates from Harvard with a Bachelor of Arts cum laude in East Asian languages and civilizations, and gets a law degree, and joins the faculty of University of Chicago Law School. Like, he's like, if he was a real dissident, if he was really telling the truth about uncomfortable stuff, he wouldn't have all this stuff, right? Can say he was influenced by Thomas Aquinas and Joseph de Maistre and Cardinal Newman and Carl Schmitt, but his last influence is Cass Sunstein. So,
yeah, this is where I actually know him from. Most people in the conspiracy realm know of Adrian Vermeule because of his work with Cass Sunstein, where they promoted cognitive infiltration in that policy paper, where effectively the government would get into conspiracy circles or any just like dissident circles and just insert
he's
or bad information, right, to discredit them.
Yeah, so Vermeule was raised an Episcopalian, abandoning the denomination in college, but returning later in life. He announced his conversion to Catholicism in 2016. He said in an October 2016 interview that the logic behind his Catholic beliefs is inspired by John Henry Newman, and added, raised a Protestant despite all my thrashing and twisting. I eventually couldn't help but believe that the apostolic succession through Peter was, as the designated leader and primus inter pares, is in some logical or theological sense prior to everything else, including even scripture, whose formation was guided and completed by the apostles and their successors, themselves inspired by the Holy Spirit, which is still true. But this guy knows all this stuff. Like, he's working with, Eric Posner and the Executive Unbound after the Macedonian Republic. Like, he understands, terror and balance, security, liberty in the courts. Like, he's writing all this stuff, working with Stephen Breyer, and Eric Posner is probably related to Judge Richard Posner. I wouldn't, I don't know. But like, he's working in these elite circles, and he has a non-white wife, and he's, rather than just admit that, like, the guys who say liberalism failed, like Patrick Deneen, who don't even go far enough, right? But are at least willing to say, like, this is wrong. They won't do the, and then what? Because that's kind of what guys like us do, is say, well, then, obviously, like, mass deportations and, et cetera. But one of the reasons, lots and lots of young people, right? So we saw that Compact Magazine piece about the discrimination against young white men. And then you've seen the Doge stuff, or this Somali fraud. Basically what it amounts to is that like, the most hardcore manosphere guys in 2007 or 2008 were right. That, like, everyone else in the world, like, no, this is not an exaggeration, like, everyone in Africa only survives because the U.S. taxpayer subsidizes their food. And then they're like, oh no, okay, 20% of Africa that would die without, like, reaching into my wallet and, like, immiserating me and my family? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Like, it's a significant amount of people in Africa would die without taking my money. And that's a problem. And, the same in India, and the same in, the more poor parts, South and Central America. Would Guatemala survive without the United States? Probably not. Like, remittances, or, would Mexico survive without, like, remittances and like drug money from America? Like, no, probably not really. I mean, what percentage of Mexico is already living in America? 10%, 20%? Like, that's a failure as a society, And Vermeule and others just don't, he's 57 years old. He was 47 years old, and he finally, like, he's a bright guy. Stupid people do not get do not get to be faculty at the University of Chicago Law School. That does not happen. So what is it that at 47, like, he finally came to the conclusion? Or is he sitting there going, well, if I don't get in front of this, like, this Trump backlash, there's these philosophical stuff, and you've been seeing it for years, and there were other people writing about it. I mean, Mencius Moldbug was writing in 2006 or 2007, like the Ron Paul revolution that failed. Like, obviously this stuff was, like, in the air. And so I think for him, at least, like, it's very obvious that, like, he tried to jump in front of the train and get it moving somewhere else other than like, hey, Jews are a problem and everyone else needs to go home, and feminism was bad, which are all obvious and true things. But like, if the second you start saying anything like that, then the whole liberal edifice falls apart. And that's what I think a lot of people are trying to do, like Bishop Barron or others. Like I think that there's real. I mean, honestly, I stopped paying attention to a lot of these people just because. I mean, once you understand the problem, like anyone who makes apologia for Jews, it's just like, okay, well, bye, right? Like, what is there to talk about? Like, this person's obviously compromised somehow. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein worked with, there was talk in, I think it was WikiLeaks, like, the CIA and other stuff, like, tried to undermine the church. If you think that Theodore McCarrick, the most prolific that we know of, the most prolific ecclesiastical molester that we know of, the Cardinal Archbishop of the imperial capital of the world, Washington, D.C., was the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and also the Archbishop of the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Jeffrey Epstein had his island. Now, he wasn't the bishop of the Virgin Islands, but he's the Archbishop. That Washington, D.C. has jurisdiction over the Virgin Islands, and Theodore McCarrick was a frequent visitor to said Virgin Islands. If you think Theodore McCarrick can be the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. at the same time that Dennis Hastert, also a homosexual pedophile, compromised, was the Speaker of the House and third in line to the presidency at the same time, like the exact same time. Like, I guarantee you there were occasions that, big things in D.C. where the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. and the Speaker of the House were at the same event. And they're both homosexual pedophiles, and they've both been getting away with it for years, and nobody knows. Oh, and Nancy Pelosi is the leader of the opposition, and her husband's possibly a closet case, and her dad and brother were both mayors of Baltimore when it was a mob-run city. And at some point, it strains credulity to think, no, this is all just coincidence. Nobody knew, and nobody had any idea that the guys who is ecclesiastically in charge of Jeffrey Epstein's island was also a pedophile. That's just a coincidence. You're crazy for being like a little skeptical of that. And to give you a couple examples, Monsignor Rossi from the Archdiocese of Washington was the rector of the National Cathedral of in Washington, the Basilica of Our Lady there in Washington, D.C., like right next to, I think it's right by the Supreme Court. It's on the mall. And he was a prolific homosexual. Of course, there's been all the abuse cases that have come out in the last, several years. And at some point, one or two guys, it's like an unfortunate problem. At some point, it becomes policy. The guy who is now the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Cardinal Fernandez, as a celibate man, wrote a book called "Heal Me with Your Mouth: The Art of Kissing." Like, really, like, you can't keep promoting these gay guys to these positions of responsibility, and then be like, "Oh, how was I supposed to know?" Well, because it was your job to know, right? You've been involved in politics a long time, Jose. If you're running the gun GOA, right? If you're the executive director of Gun Owners of America, and all of a sudden everyone on your staff is like proponents of gun control, bro, what did you do? Like
yeah, exactly. What's the point?
Your secretary is like a rabid anti-gunner and hates guns. Like, what? What are you?
Yeah.
Like the guys in the mail, the guys in the policy shop hate guns. Like, like at some point, personnel is policy, and I think that things are deeply confusing right now, like in the church and in the world. And so I don't want to like, I'm just a guy, man, like I'm not trying to pretend that I know everything with respect to like what the situation in the church is or who some trustworthy people are or whatever. But, by your fruits, you should know them. Like, are they telling the truth about Jews? First and foremost, that's a guarantee that they're an honest man. Or maybe not right about everything, but if they're not going to talk about that, they're a problem. Are they going to be at least open to the honesty and truth about racial differences? Are they going to be talk about the problems with liberalism as such? Like, and for the most part, these sort of things work themselves out. In 10 years, no one will, I don't want to say no one will go to the Novus Ordo Mass, but it'll be very obvious. Like once all the boomers are gone, they're like, this thing failed hard and it's not going to work in the future. I mean, it's already obvious, but it'll be really, really, really obvious to even the most like jaded or like plan trusting person that like this is not going to work. And so, in the meantime, all you can do is like learn more and try and practice the faith as best you can. I will say that I think that there are people who aren't necessarily bad actors, just mistaken. And a big part of the problem or a big part of the reason why you see such a massive, like the Groypers are very Catholic, right? And a lot of them are converts. And I think a lot of that is just like, you've got a bunch of young men who were raised on the internet who had no dad, whether that was because their mom was a single mom or divorced or what, or their dad was just like a lousy, like Gen X dad who was kind of like, yeah, kid, do whatever you want, go to public school, and didn't really understand like the full slate of issues these kids were going to face. And so like they were just unprepared to deal with the fact that like this plague of fatherlessness that you see in society is, has real and deleterious effects on young people. Right. And so you have all these young people who are looking for some kind of stability in their lives, and they try and find it in the church, whether it's the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. They look for tradition, and that's going to save them. And to a large extent, I mean, they're largely correct that, yeah, this is what you need is true religion in your life. But like just trusting that like Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Argentinian Jesuit with lots of homosexual friends, was and published stuff that normalized reception of communion for like divorced and remarried people, like in contravention to thousands of years of church teaching. That's like you should be more skeptical of that. You should be more skeptical of that than just like, because he's the Pope, he's heckin' based, man. Like, no, I mean, like the aesthetics are cool and I get it, but think a little bit more would be my advice for that. And again, I don't know like who's a bad actor and who's not, but I can tell you that anybody who lies about, is the Freemasonic like revolutions in like South America a problem? Like, yeah, they were a problem. Are they like the thing we got to worry about now? Like the ghost of Simon Bolivar and George Washington are going to like get together with their weird aprons and like do that. No, the problem today is Jews. You can say that like Bolivar was like a Jewish cat's paw back in the day. And I don't know if that's like necessarily that. Philosophically speaking, I think that that's a pretty strong case to be made for that sort of thing, but I don't think it matters right now in the broad scheme of things. Like learn more and understand where the errors came from. Sure. I don't want to say ignore all that, but like in the day-to-day, like living of your life, like the most important thing is you find a mass that doesn't suck. And like to the extent that you can, like anybody that you listen to, if they can't be honest about like, the Cardinal Pizzaballa of the Cardinal Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Orthodox churches just came out with a statement condemning Christian Zionism. Like if you can't at least do that, then you're not addressing the issue. It's like living in a house where there's a hole in the roof and it's raining outside and like your house is flooding and like being like deeply concerned with the fact that the sink is leaking. Right. Like, oh, there's a drip in the sink. Like, dude, you got a 3-foot hole in the roof and it's a thunderstorm outside. What are you doing?
Yeah. Well, man, I think this is a good place to wind things down, but go ahead and plug your show and other content you're working on these days.
Well, thank you. And like I said, you've been doing spectacular work lately. Really, really top notch. I would strongly urge everyone to, kick Jose a few bucks, subscribe to the Substack, but you can find me over at The Fundamental Principle. I'll shoot you a link, I think. And that's my, religion and politics focus show where I kind of just discuss, religion from a dissident right, clerical fascist political perspective. And I discuss politics from a, traditionalist Catholic perspective. And I try and make the two meet because I strongly believe that there's no dealing with the one without the other. So,
all right, man. We'll definitely include that in the show notes. And again, thank you for coming onto the show again. I always find your insights fascinating and you do not pull punches whatsoever. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. And with that, El Nino has spoken.